The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Hartwell Tower smelled the way all boardrooms smelled, of leather and recycled air and the particular kind of silence that money creates when it gathers in one place. The windows ran floor to ceiling, and beyond them, Toronto stretched in every direction, gray and enormous under a February sky that had not decided whether to snow. No one in the room was paying attention to the windows. They were paying attention to the man standing beside the service cart near the far wall. He had come in at 8:30 to set up the coffee. He had done this every Tuesday for the past 11 months, rolling the cart through the side door, arranging the cups in their saucers, setting out the cream and the sugar and the small plates of shortbread that the partners had requested, because someone's assistant had read somewhere that shortbread improved the mood of men making large decisions. He wore the gray uniform of the building's contracted facilities staff, pressed but old, with a small white name badge on the chest that read Ray. He was somewhere in his mid-50s with the kind of face that had once been sharp and had since gone quiet, deep-set eyes, a jaw that had learned patience, hands that were large and still. His name, the full name on his employment record, was Raymond Croft. No one in the room knew that. They knew him as the man who brought the coffee. The meeting had been called to address the acquisition of Meridian Diagnostics, a mid-sized medical imaging company based in Hamilton, that Hartwell Capital had been circling for the better part of a year. The deal was valued at $480 million. The lead partner on the file, a man named Elliot Granger, had been working on the valuation model for 3 months. He was 41 years old, had an MBA from Queens and a corner office on the 39th floor, and he spoke with the clipped confidence of someone who had never been wrong in a room where it mattered. There were 7 people seated at the table, Elliot Granger at the head. Beside him, a woman named Patricia Voss, the firm's chief legal counsel, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the manner of someone who had heard every version of every argument and found all of them slightly wanting. To her left, 2 junior analysts whose names were not yet important to the people who made decisions, and, across from them, 2 senior partners, Robert Fielding and Hugh Carnegie, who had been at the firm long enough to remember when it occupied 2 floors instead of 12. Raymond Croft poured the coffee. He did this carefully and without sound, moving from cup to cup, and if he heard the conversation at the table, which he did clearly, because the room was not large and no one lowered their voice for a man in a gray uniform, he showed no sign of it. Elliot Granger was explaining the model. The discount rate we've applied is 8.4%, he said, moving the laser pointer across the projection screen at the far end of the room. Conservative, but defensible. The EBITDA multiple comes out at 11.2, which is in line with comparable transactions in the diagnostic imaging space over the last 18 months. Patricia Voss looked at the number on the screen. And you've stress-tested the revenue projections. 3 scenarios: base, downside, and severe downside. Even in the severe scenario, the return on invested capital clears our hurdle rate by the end of year 4. Robert Fielding leaned forward. He was 63, the oldest person in the room, and he had the deliberate quality of a man who had learned that speaking slowly made other people listen more carefully. The regulatory piece concerns me. The Competition Bureau review on a deal this size. Our legal team has modeled a 12-week review period, Elliot said. Patricia's already drafted the response framework. Patricia nodded once, which was her way of confirming something without committing to enthusiasm. Hugh Carnegie, who had not spoken yet, was looking at the slide, showing the revenue projections for Meridian's Ontario contracts. He was tapping his pen against the table in a rhythm that suggested something was bothering him, without yet having formed into a specific thought. Raymond Croft finished the coffee and moved to the side of the room. He straightened the napkins on the cart. He did not leave because no one had told him to leave, and because there was still the matter of the shortbread plates, which needed to be refilled during the break. Elliot Granger clicked to the next slide. The Ontario provincial contracts represent 63% of Meridian's current revenue. The assumption in the model is that these renew at roughly equivalent terms when they come up in 2027. It was a statement, not a question. It was offered the way a man offers a statement when he believes the question has already been answered. The room was quiet for a moment. Then, from the side wall, there was a sound. Small, almost nothing. The sound of a person who has decided not to say something and then reconsidered. Elliot Granger turned. Raymond Croft was standing beside the cart with a coffee pot in his hand, and he was looking at the projection screen with an expression that might have been in a different context, called concentration. "Something wrong with the coffee?" Elliot asked. He did not mean it unkindly. He meant it the way people mean it when they are not really asking about the coffee. Raymond looked at him. "The contracts," he said. The word sat in the room. "I'm sorry," Elliot said. "The Ontario provincial contracts." Raymond set the coffee pot down on the cart. "They're not standard renewal agreements. The 2027 clause has a competitive retender requirement. It was added in the Provincial Health Authority's procurement reform package, the one that came out of the Auditor General's report in October 2023. Any contract above $8 million in annual value goes back to open tender. Meridian's largest Ontario agreement is $44 million. The room was very still. Patricia Voss had taken off her reading glasses. She was looking at Raymond Croft with the particular attention she reserved for things that required her to update her understanding of a situation. "You're saying the revenue assumption is wrong," Hugh Carnegie said. He had stopped tapping his pen. "I'm saying the assumption that the contracts renew at equivalent terms isn't supportable," Raymond said. "If Meridian goes to open tender on that $44 million agreement, they're competing against two companies that have been undercutting them on provincial bids for the past 2 years. Symmetry Imaging out of Mississauga and the Ontario subsidiary of MedPath Group. If Meridian loses that contract or wins it at a materially lower margin, the revenue picture in years 2 and 3 looks very different from what's on the slide." No one spoke. Elliot Granger was looking at the man in the gray uniform with an expression that moved through several stages: confusion, then irritation, then something more guarded. "That's an interesting point," he said, and his voice had the careful quality of a person who is deciding how much weight to give to a thing before he knows where it came from. "It's not a point," Raymond said quietly. "It's a fact. The procurement reform package is public record. Section 14, subsection 3. The thresholds and retender requirements are listed. And you know this because," Elliot began. "Because I read it," Raymond said. He said it without inflection. Not rudely, not with performance. The way a person states a thing that is simply true and sees no reason to ornament it. Robert Fielding was looking at Raymond Croft now, with the focused attention of a man who had spent 40 years in rooms where the most important thing said was sometimes said by the person everyone else had stopped watching. He had learned, over those 40 years, to notice when that was happening. "What's your name?" Robert asked. "Ray," the man said. And then, after a moment, "Raymond Croft. How long have you been with building services, Mr. Croft?" 11 months. And before that, Raymond looked at the older man. He had the expression of someone considering how much of a true answer to give. "Before that," he said, "I was elsewhere." The break came 20 minutes later, called by Patricia Voss, who said she needed to make a call but who actually needed to think. The junior analysts left to get more printouts. Hugh Carnegie stepped into the hallway to check his messages. Elliot Granger stood by the window. Robert Fielding poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and walked to the side of the room where Raymond Croft was stacking the used cups onto the lower shelf of the cart. Fielding moved with the unhurried quality of someone who had already decided what he wanted to know and was simply finding the right moment to ask it. "You didn't study the Auditor General's report to make better coffee," Robert said. Raymond didn't look up immediately. "No," he said. "So what did you do before?" Raymond straightened and looked at Robert Fielding directly, the way he looked at the screen, without performance, without deflection. "I ran a fund," he said. "What kind of fund?" "Private equity, mid-market, healthcare and infrastructure mostly." Robert was quiet for a moment. "Based where?" "Vancouver originally. We had offices in Calgary and Toronto. Had I wound it down 4 years ago." Robert Fielding absorbed this. He was the kind of man who did not ask the obvious follow-up question immediately, because he had learned that the obvious follow-up question was usually the wrong one. He waited. "My son," Raymond said, and then stopped. He looked down at the cart for a moment. "My son was sick for a long time. And then he wasn't sick anymore. And then I didn't. The fun didn't feel like the thing anymore. And I needed something to do with my hands." He said it plainly, the way people say true things when they've stopped caring whether anyone finds them impressive. Robert Fielding looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "The model, If you were running the numbers, how far off are we? Raymond considered this carefully. The base case probably overstates revenue in year 2 by 15 to 20%. If Meridian loses the retender on the big Ontario contract, which I'd put at maybe 40% probability given the competitive landscape, the downside scenario isn't a downside scenario anymore. It's the most likely scenario. The hurdle rate doesn't clear in year 4. It might not clear in year 6. That changes the price. It changes everything upstream of the price. Robert set his coffee cup down. He looked out the window at the gray February sky in the city below it. Elliot has been working this deal for 3 months, Robert said. I know, Raymond said. That's going to be a difficult conversation. I imagine it will be. You're not concerned about having caused that difficulty. Raymond looked at him steadily. You're about to spend $480 million on a set of assumptions that may be materially incorrect, he said. I think the difficulty was already there. Patricia Voss found the procurement reform package during the break. It took her 6 minutes. She read section 14, subsection 3, twice, and then she sat in the small side office they used for calls and looked at the wall for a moment. And then she went back into the boardroom and placed the document on the table in front of Robert Fielding without saying anything. He read it. He nodded once. When the others came back, the dynamic in the room had shifted in the way that dynamics shift when something true has been introduced into a conversation that was previously only aspirationally true. Elliot Granger was the last one in. He sat down and looked at Patricia and then at Robert and read the room correctly, because Elliot was not, whatever his other limitations, a man who missed the weather. What did I miss? He said. Patricia slid the document across the table to him. He read it. His face went through the same stages Raymond had watched before. The confusion, the calculation, the guarded rearrangement. But Elliot was also intelligent, genuinely. And when he looked up, his expression had passed through defensiveness and come out the other side into something more useful. The retender threshold, he said. Yes, Patricia said. We didn't model that, no. Elliot looked across the room at Raymond Croft, who was standing where he always stood, at the side wall beside the cart. The look was long and complicated. It contained the thing that men feel when they have been wrong in front of people they need to impress. And it contained something else too. Something that, in a man of less ego, would have been straightforwardness, but in Elliot came out as a kind of careful respect. You know this space, Elliot said. It was not quite a statement and not quite a question. I knew it once, Raymond said. Would you? Elliot stopped. He picked up the pen in front of him and looked at it and then set it down. If you had to rebuild the model with the correct assumptions, how long would that take you? Raymond looked at the projection screen and then at Elliot. Depends on whether I have access to Meridian's contract schedule and their margin data by service line. We have all of that, Hugh Carnegie said, and his voice had the particular quality of a man who has just made a decision about where the useful thing is in a room. Then 2 hours, Raymond said, maybe less. He worked at the table in the small side office where Patricia had made her call. Someone brought him a laptop. Someone else brought more coffee, which struck him as slightly funny in a way he did not express. The junior analysts, their names were Ben and Catherine, sat across from him, and within 15 minutes they had stopped treating him like a guest and started treating him like a person who knew what he was doing, which was a transition Raymond had always found more meaningful than formal introductions. He rebuilt the model from the revenue line down. He applied the correct regulatory assumptions to the Ontario contract cluster. He modeled 3 retender scenarios. Meridian wins at current margin. Meridian wins at reduced margin. Meridian loses to a competitor. And weighted them by probability using the bid history from the provincial procurement database, which was public and which he pulled up from memory in terms of where to find it. He adjusted the EBITDA multiple. He stress-tested the working capital assumptions, which had been too generous. He found a depreciation schedule in the fixed asset notes that suggested Meridian's imaging equipment was older than the slide deck implied, and he adjusted the capital expenditure projections accordingly. Catherine, the junior analyst, watched him work with the focused attention of someone learning something. At one point, she asked why he was using a different terminal growth rate than the one in the original model, and he explained it to her, not in the way that people explain things to demonstrate their expertise, but in the way that people explain things because the question was good and the answer was worth understanding. When he was finished, he printed 3 copies and brought them back into the boardroom. The revised numbers were sobering. In the base case, the return on invested capital cleared the hurdle rate in year 5, not year 4. In the most likely scenario, the one that accounted properly for the retender risk, the deal required a price reduction of between $40 and $65 million to produce the same expected return. Robert Fielding looked at the numbers for a long time. Hugh Carnegie said, "So we go back to Meridian. We renegotiate the price," Patricia said, "or we walk." Elliot was looking at the summary page. His expression was quiet now, the defensiveness fully gone. He looked, Raymond thought, like a man who had decided that being wrong in a correctable situation was not the worst thing in the world, which was, in Raymond's experience, the most important professional realization a person could have, and the one that most people arrived at too late. "The retender piece is not Meridian's fault," Elliot said. "They may not even know the implication." "That's not a reason to pay for their uncertainty," Robert said. "No," Elliot agreed. "It isn't." The room settled into the particular quiet of people who have work to do and now know what the work is. Robert Fielding looked across the room at Raymond Croft, who had taken his place again at the side of the room, because the cart was still there, and he was still on shift, and the shortbread plates were still technically his responsibility. "Mr. Croft," Robert said. "Yes, I'd like you to come back tomorrow, not to bring the coffee." Raymond looked at him. "I'm not looking to come back to this," he said. He said it gently, without apology. "I'm not asking you to run a fund," Robert said. "I'm asking you to sit in a room and tell us when we're wrong." He paused. "We'll compensate you appropriately. I have a job. You have 2 jobs now," Robert said, "if you want them." Raymond was quiet for a moment. Through the floor-to-soiling windows, the February sky had made its decision. It was snowing now, lightly, the kind of snow that fell in Toronto in February without any particular drama, as though it had more important things to think about. "I'll think about it," Raymond said. He collected the coffee cups, returned the shortbread plates to the cart, and wheeled it back through the side door. He walked home that evening because he preferred to walk when he had things to think about, and he had the route memorized. South on Bay, then west on Wellington, through the neighborhood where the streets narrowed and the houses were old brick and the trees in February were bare and skeletal and honest. His son, whose name was Daniel, and who was 26 now, and studying environmental law at Osgood, had once told him that walking was thinking with your body. Raymond had written it down. He kept a small notebook in the breast pocket of his coat, not his uniform coat, but his own gray wool coat, which was the same shade of gray as the uniform, and which he had not bought to match, but which had always struck him as fitting. He thought about the boardroom, and the numbers, and the way the junior analyst Catherine had asked her question, directly, without hedging, and the way Elliot Granger's face had moved through its various stages and come out somewhere useful. He thought about Robert Fielding, who was 63, and had the quality of a man who had learned to pay attention to the right things. Raymond respected that more than he could easily explain. He thought about Daniel, who had a room at the top of their house, his and Daniel's, which was not large, and which Raymond had kept because it was where Daniel had come home from the hospital and where, in the months after, they had learned how to be 2 people instead of 3, and who was probably studying now, or on the phone with the girl he had been seeing, or making the pasta he had learned to make during the period when Raymond was working double shifts at the building and couldn't always get home in time to cook. He had not told Daniel about what had happened in the boardroom. He would, probably. Daniel would find it funny in the particular way he found things funny, quietly, with his sighs, and then with a slow smile that he had inherited from his mother. Raymond did not think very often about whether he had made the right choices. He had stopped asking that question around the time Daniel came home from the hospital, the second time, the time that mattered, because it had seemed then less useful than paying attention to the next hour, and then the hour after that, and then the day, and then the weeks, until it was months, and the months were years, and the question had simply lost its urgency in the face of the actual ongoing fact of his son being alive and becoming someone. He had wound down the fund. He had not found it difficult, which had told him something about the fund. He had taken the building job because a man he knew from the hospital's parent support group had mentioned there was work and the work was straightforward and paid enough. And because he had discovered during the long months of the illness that his appetite for complexity had become, temporarily or perhaps permanently, very small. 11 months later, the appetite for complexity had apparently returned on its own schedule without consulting him. He thought about Robert Fielding's offer. He thought about the junior analyst's question and the way she had written down the answer. He turned onto his street. The snow was thicker now, settling on the hoods of the parked cars and the front steps of the houses. A dog barked somewhere. A light was on in the second floor of his house, which meant Daniel was home. He stood on the front step for a moment in the snow, his hand on the cold iron railing, and looked up at the lit window and thought about the things that had happened today. A man in a gray uniform with a coffee pot in his hand, a set of numbers on a screen, a room full of people who had been wrong in a correctable way, and thought, not for the first time, that life organized itself into very strange shapes, and that the shapes were not always what you expected them to be when you were inside them, and that this was perhaps what people meant when they talked about grace. He went inside. Daniel was at the kitchen table with his laptop and a bowl of pasta and a highlighter, and he looked up when Raymond came in and said, "There's more on the stove." "Thank you," Raymond said. He hung up his coat. He washed his hands. He got a bowl and served himself from the pot on the stove, which was pasta with the sauce Daniel made with canned tomatoes and garlic and a quantity of black pepper that exceeded any reasonable recommendation, and which Raymond had quietly decided was one of the best things he had ever eaten. He sat down across from his son. Daniel was reading something on his laptop and making notes in the margin of a printed case summary, and Raymond sat with his bowl and ate and did not say anything for a few minutes, which was the particular kind of silence that they had built between them over the years, comfortable, inhabited, full of the ordinary weight of two people who knew each other well. Then Daniel looked up. "Good day," he said. Raymond considered the question. "Interesting," he said. Daniel nodded, the way young people nod when they have received the amount of information they expected and are not surprised by it. He went back to his reading. Raymond ate his pasta and looked at his son, the bent head, the pen moving across the margin, the pasta going cold beside the laptop because Daniel always forgot to eat when he was working, and felt, not for the first time, the specific and enormous fact of it. The fact of sitting in a warm kitchen in a February in Toronto with his son across from him and pasta on the stove and outside the snow coming down on the parked cars and the bare trees and the old brick houses. He had held this fact before, in the years when it was not guaranteed, and he held it now, in the years when it was, and it was not smaller for being permanent. If anything, it was larger, because it was no longer held against its possible absence, but simply for itself. He would call Robert Fielding in the morning, or he wouldn't. He had not decided yet. There were things to consider. What the work would ask of him, what he would ask of the work, whether the appetite for complexity that had returned today was a real appetite or only the appetite of a particular afternoon, the kind that fades. But that was tomorrow. Tonight there was the kitchen and the pasta and the sound of Daniel's pen moving across the paper and the snow, outside that had stopped being relevant the moment Raymond had stepped through the door. He finished his bowl. He got up to get more. He did not say anything about the boardroom or the model or the man named Robert Fielding, who had the quality of someone who had learned to pay attention to the right things. He put his bowl in the sink and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking out at the back garden, where the snow was now an inch deep on the wooden table they left out through the winter, and he thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of thinking. Knowledge does not announce itself. It does not wear the right clothes or carry the right badge or sit at the head of the table. It waits, patient and quiet, in the places where no one expects to find it, and when it speaks, briefly, without drama, without asking for anything in return. The rooms it speaks into are never quite the same again. Raymond Croft washed his bowl and put it in the rack and went to sit with his son.